Hey, what's up, everybody? Sorry about that issue with the link. Things are a little disorderly around here this morning. So I guess this afternoon. So it's been a little bit difficult getting things in order. But very happy to see you. Welcome back. As you know, we had the exam on Friday, and very happy with all of your hard work. Just continue to stay engaged. We do plan to begin a new unit this week, and we'll begin talking about the coming assignments in the next few weeks. And of course, we've got spring break coming up, and I'm sure that you're looking forward to that very much. But we do want to accomplish a lot this week because we'll continue to talk about not just country experiences in Africa, but also different concepts and different perspectives that become important. And what we'll do this week that's especially interesting is compare the experience of Africa and Latin America after independence. And in particular, we'll talk about the ways that political fragmentation and conflict contributed to economic stagnation and these lost decades, this period of time that delayed development and really kind of slowed down the process of consolidation and eventual state building and the the building of a system that could contribute to the growth that we assess when we talk about development over the long term. So these are those periods of time that we talk much less about when we focus on the contemporary period in the advances in places like Ethiopia or the advance to near high income status in places like Chile. So we'll talk then about both Africa as well as Latin America, and we'll talk about the similarities and differences in their experiences over time. So the reading I had you do for this week is a really interesting reading because it considers the economic history of the Latin American countries and the African countries, and it evaluates their historical trajectories by considering the similarities and the differences. Instead of talking about variables and measures, they do discuss those. They talk about some of the large similarities and differences that make these experiences useful to study and to compare. And so we'll be doing the same thing in here, and we'll be building on the discussion set off by that article. And we'll do our very best to try to learn from these experiences and treat them as relatively similar. And although some of the patterns in Africa are different and distinct, what the cases have in common includes political fragmentation, corruption, patrimonialism, and clientelism. And so we'll be developing a lot of these concepts, and we'll start to talk about how development outcomes today result from some of those patterns. And then eventually on Friday, what I'd like us to do is have more of a discussion about maybe what the future might hold and whether African countries can expect to make the advances that Latin American countries did once they eventually broke out of that period of disorder and fragmentation. And for Latin America, that was really the beginning of the 20th century. And for African countries, many would say that that was the beginning of the 21st century. So there are some clear differences in terms of time, but we'll see that the consistencies are quite important. So African countries we know were plundered more or less by European colonial powers. and those included Belgium and France and the United Kingdom. And countries like Belgium in particular were especially rapacious. And King Leopold treated the Congo like his private estate. And so these countries, in addition to being subjected to mercantilist policies, in addition to being subjugated and subjected to colonial rule, they were subjected to that scramble for Africa in the disorderly and sort of incoherent way that the colonial powers themselves drew the boundaries. And so in the 1950s and 60s, when decolonization started in Africa, these countries were not set up to succeed in the way of forming a nation or a coherent identity or engaging in state building. Instead, they were set up for failure in terms of the conflict that was likely to result from the mixing of groups with very different identities based on boundaries that were designed relatively arbitrarily by colonial powers that intended mainly to channel wealth to themselves, and in the process left behind institutions that were extractive and destructive. And so the decolonization period generated a lot of political instability because these countries were not set up to succeed, and the groups that were brought together under their auspices were not at all complementary. And this political instability, characterized above all by coups, military coups, generally, if the military wasn't in control of the country, it was dictators or strong personalities who were able to concentrate power. But even then, politics often became a revolving door, and political instability was the defining feature. Violent conflict also tended to overlap with instability because groups that did not control the state would find themselves deeply at odds with each other and would be fearful of not controlling the state. And so civil conflict would result very, very frequently. And in a moment, we'll look at an example of Nigeria, where different ethnic groups were immediately at odds with each other upon decolonization and the withdrawal of European powers. And then the sum of all of this was economic stagnation, the inability of the state to concentrate power and to establish a monopoly of authority and to impose order, the violent conflict between groups, the instability politically and economically, all generated stagnation that lasted a half century or more. And countries like Nigeria, which had enormous abundances of natural resources, nevertheless stagnated and did not grow adequately and seemed to exhibit all of the symptoms of post-independence decline. The authors from this week refer to this as a period of lost decades, or a period of slow growth. And so this gift that I've shown here shows you that the period of decolonization has actually been long and protracted. It began in 1950 and it continues really to the present day, although by the 2000s, virtually all African countries had been decolonized. You can see, though, that this piecemeal process has involved a gradual withdrawal of European powers, such that by 2011, most of the continent is independent. But again, this period has not coincided with growth and stability and order. Instead, it has coincided with disorder, conflict, and underdevelopment. So let's consider the case of Nigeria. This is sort of a typical case because of the potential for development inherent in abundant natural resources, revenues, and gains from which could have been reinvested in more productive, in more consumption driven activities, but a place nevertheless where groups and group conflict have been an important impediment to political stability and economic growth. And all of this can be understood as sort of the, the byproduct or the result of colonialism in the withdrawal of European powers, in the leaving behind of extractive institutions and boundaries and borders that were arbitrarily drawn and that don't impose any coherence on ethnic groups that predate the colonial period. And so all of this is a, a, a recipe for slow growth and underdevelopment. And we'll compare this eventually to Latin America, but first let's focus on the example of Nigeria.
It's been 50 years since the start of the Nigerian Civil War. It's also known as the Biafra War. It was one of the bloodiest and most divisive conflicts in post-independent Africa. Yet so many years later, some of the issues that set it off continue to make the headlines. In 1960, Britain, the colonial power, granted independence to Nigeria, a diverse country with hundreds of ethnic groups. But at the time, Nigeria was dominated by the Hausa people in the northern region, the Yorubas in the western region, and the Igbos in the eastern region. But it wasn't long before this new nation, Nigeria, was plunged into political and ethnic turmoil. This involved two military takeovers in 1966. And soon, these tensions led to the killings of thousands of minority Igbos living in northern Nigeria. So in the southeast, a military officer called Emeka Ojukwu declared the independence of the Republic of Biafra on behalf of the Igbo people. But Nigeria would not accept this. And on the 6th of July, 1967, civil war broke out. And it raged on for the next 2.5 years. It's estimated that more than 1 million people died, most of them from hunger. In 1968, images of the famine were streamed worldwide. Biafran leaders used these pictures to gain sympathy for their cause. Around the world, protesters and celebrities campaigned for an end to the conflict. Back on the battlefield, the Nigerians were stronger and better equipped, and in January 1970, the Biafran secessionists surrendered. The war might have ended, but the idea of Biafra didn't. In Nigeria, some believe the underlying ethnic grievances have not been fully confronted or resolved. A new generation of pro-Biafra separatists has reignited the cause, and they hold marches and protests regularly in Nigeria and abroad. Arguably the most prominent group is the Indigenous People of Biafra, or IPOB. Its founder, the British Nigerian activist Nnamdi Kanu, was arrested for his rhetoric in 2015, but his detention has only boosted his popularity.
I've said before, and allow me to repeat, Biafra or death. One of the two must happen.
The establishment is still opposed to the idea of Biafra. The human rights group Amnesty International claims that in May last year, the Nigerian army killed 150 unarmed people during IPOB rallies. The army and police strongly denied this. So, is a Biafran breakaway likely or even plausible? Will there be renewed tension or perhaps a referendum? It's a sensitive topic, but as Nigerians look back, they'll be keen to avoid a repeat of the dark history that people suffered.
So Nigeria is just one example, but the important point is that these ethnic group differences that resulted from arbitrary boundaries drawn during colonialism eventually gave way to conflict that contributed to underdevelopment in the post-independence period. And this focus on fragmentation and disorder is really the defining feature of the post-independence lost decades that the authors from this week's reading write about. And although this may seem not directly related, it absolutely is, because remember that civil conflict, civil war is extraordinarily destructive. It results in wartime destruction, the leveling of communities and infrastructure. It results in the wholesale reallocation of productive resources and labor and energy into conflict and war, resources that could have been invested in the economy and could have been channeled and mobilized for other purposes if the civil conflict had not gone on. And not to mention the impact on trust and the impact on social cohesion. The idea of a nation does not fully exist in a place like Nigeria. And so, in some ways, that psychological component of nation building is critical to the formation of markets and the formation of trusting networks, so that are essential to eventual functioning of markets and growth and development, industrialization, all these things that we consider essential to development. So it is all related, and the civil conflict and the disorder
It's been
is is something that we can actually look at and we can consider from the perspective of a number of different indicators. And those might include, for instance, the number of assassinations or the number of general strikes, the number of incidents of guerrilla warfare, major government crises like coups or political or constitutional crises, purges, which would often relate to those crises, political riots, revolutions, anti government demonstrations. The 8 countries that these indicators are for in the data set that this data is drawn from include Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zaire. And the period is 1950 to 1973, just that initial post independence period. And you notice that there is considerable violence. It's a period of bloodshed and disorder and conflict by essentially every measure. And this does include Nigeria, where those conflicts between the groups that were just discussed characterize the post-independence period. But it also includes a number of other countries that we've discussed in class too. And you'll notice that assassinations and major government crises, as well as purges, are all relatively common, and this is because political violence was especially rampant during this period. And in some places in Africa, like Somalia, uh, this violence and this disorder continue, but in many other countries, especially since the 2000s, much of the this violence has been brought down. And so we are considering this from a historical vantage point, but you'll notice as we eventually move to the Latin American cases that the patterns are very, very similar. Another way to look at this is to look at the patterns of political competition in Africa. And we can compare the periods of 1970 to 1974, 1975 to 1979, 1980 to 1984, 1985 to 1989, and 1990 to 1995. And one way of looking at this is comparing the share of total observations that were one party rule, no party rule, or competitive. And you'll notice that at the beginning of the period, one party rule is the single most common, and no party rule is the second most common. And that pattern does endure more or less until about 1990. And beginning in about 1990, there's a surge of democratization in Africa and a period of extensive political liberalization that results in many, many transitions from authoritarian rule to democratic rule. And that's what you see here, where in 1990 to 1995, the shift seems to show a transition from one party rule to competitive democratic rule. But for that first 35 or 40 years, you saw, or excuse me, that first 15 or 20 years, you saw almost exclusively or primarily one party or no party rule. And that is a reflection of that political fragmentation, that disorder, and that instability. why is it that during a period of political disorder and fragmentation and civil conflict, one party rule or no party rule proliferates? Well, it's because it's during those periods that groups that are able to establish a monopoly of violence or impose some control, they're able to concentrate power. So the military is able to impose some control during a period of civil conflict or disorder. Dictators who control militias or have control of bands of fighters might be able to obtain control or impose some control. Generally speaking, these circumstances work against political parties, and they work against competitive political parties, especially because under these circumstances, it's the logic of violence and the logic of coercion that prevails, not the logic of competition and the logic of market behavior. That only obtains once you're able to move away from conflict and establish more order and establish more consolidated political relationships. And that only begins to happen in Africa in about 1990. And so, generally speaking, then we've got about 40 years of fragmentation, of conflict, of disorder, and of slow economic growth. Now, this is extremely similar to what happened in Latin America. And to be sure, there are a number of important differences, and we don't want to overstate the similarities, but it is remarkable to go back and consider the circumstances in Latin America during the period immediately succeeding independence. And that scramble for Africa left African states like Nigeria unprepared to form nations in the same way that Spain's withdrawal and Portugal's withdrawal left Latin American countries unprepared for democracy. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to begin to identify some of the similarities and begin to prepare a portrait of post independence Latin America that we can compare to African countries since 1950. And our objective is going to be to try to understand the links between conflict and underdevelopment, the links between conflict and slow growth. And more generally, we're trying to understand what kinds of circumstances have to be in place before countries can begin to pursue economic development consciously, like they did in Latin America in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when they adopted ISI policies. So, what we're doing is we're sort of going back in time. We're kind of going backwards, working from the point in time that we've already established and studied, the ISI period. So, you look here, Chris, do you want to make a comment? Or Chris, did you just arrive?
Sorry, Professor, it was an accident.
Oh, no worries. But just so you all know, you're welcome and encouraged to comment at any time, or make an observation, or just interrupt, or whatever you want to do. I'm here for it. But this is the situation in Latin America in 1794, and this is the eve of independence. Notice that we've got those viceroyalties that I talked about. This is a political map of the Americas. So you'll notice that Spain is well represented in Latin America, as is Portugal, just because they controlled what was then basically the colony of Brazil. But this political map obscures a great deal of diversity in Latin America, because there is an extraordinary range of indigenous and native and ancient groups in these places at this time. And to put them all in one viceroyalty or another, and to confine them all to these arbitrarily drawn territories is to prepare them for chaos and disorder, because much like in Africa, in Latin America, these groups had nothing in common and there was nothing about them that was complementary. And moreover, they weren't just different in language and culture and practice and institutions, they also were different in terms of geography. So you had differences between peoples who lived in the mountains, in the Andes, and who lived in the coastal areas. You had differences between people who lived in the rainforest and who lived in the desert. You had differences between people who lived and farmed and people who fished, and so on and so forth. And I'm really just scratching the surface. The point is to say that the colonial powers concentrated power and organized these places in a way that was convenient for them and not for these indigenous societies. And so Spain's withdrawal left Latin America very unprepared for democratic state building and nation building. And really, it set them up for conflict. Simon Bolivar said, for instance, in the early 1800s, Latin America must settle for a system most likely to succeed, not the best political system. And so from the get go, these places were bound to, fall to dictatorship and authoritarian rule. Political institutions very different than those institutions that we consider inclusive and that we associate with sustainable long-term growth. So Latin America and Africa have a lot in common, even though the time periods were very, very different. And again, I want to really stress to you that the key factor here relates closely to the way in which the colonial powers arbitrarily drew the boundaries of these territories and then left these places to their own devices after configuring them in that way. This is a critical point because none of these places would have drawn these boundaries that way if they chose to. And so this is the starting point for these post-independence periods in Latin America and Africa. And so if you take a look at this, you'll notice some of that diversity. There are differences between natives and European settlers. There are differences between mixed native Europeans. There are differences between people who are noble or bear some relation to the royalty of the old world and those in the new world. In general, Latin America during the post-independence period is a diverse place, and in general, we have to understand it as a place that was not set up for development and was not set up to immediately promote growth of the kind that we would associate with development and as we've thought about it. So post-colonial Latin America really is characterized above all by violence and depression and militias. This is a period of economic destruction. This is a period of the leveling of towns and infrastructure. This is a period where no actor was able to establish central control and consolidate power and authority. This is a period where this violence begets violence and undermines economic activity. Politics, economics, law enforcement, authority, everything came to depend on violence and who could monopolize and take control of armed force, specifically in the form of who could amass a larger militia. In these circumstances where there is no state and there is no central authority, a power vacuum ensues. And that power vacuum is eventually filled by anyone who can establish control of some modicum of armed force, who can use violence, who can use coercion effectively enough to fill that power vacuum, at least temporarily. In Latin America at this time, militias were the ones who did that. And these militias always served the interests of caudillos, or these military strongmen, who would seize control and who would kind of leverage these militias in order to establish control and to establish and use coercive force. And one of the best known caudillos, or national military strongmen, was Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina, who was essentially in control from 1829 to 1851. But the rule of Manuel de Rosas is indicative of the period itself, this period of violence and disorder, this period of national caudillos, and this sustained effort to take control of militias and use force to rule, however tenuously, for an extended period, but for a short period, ultimately. No one could concentrate authority for a long enough time to develop and strengthen the state. This was a period that was above all characterized by that tenuousness. And as a result, it was a period of economic depression, and it was a period of of no growth. These were lost decades, to put it as the authors from this week's reading put it. Let's take a look at the violence indicators for Latin America and try to understand the rate and the frequency of armed conflict and violence in death. This was a period where, because the state did not yet exist, and because individuals would succeed by taking control of armed force, this was a period of disagreement about fundamental visions. And these caudillos were fundamentally at odds with each other because they had different ideas about how to set up the state, whether it would be a unitary or a federal state, a democracy or a military state, a monarchy or a republic, and so on and so forth. And these different groups, these different militias, made it their objective to eliminate each other. So in Argentina, for example, Manuel de Rosas would say death to the Unitarians, because he wanted a federal state that would grant Buenos Aires province considerably more autonomy. He himself was a caudillo and a rancher who owned land, and his interests depended on considerable autonomy from the center. But Manuel de Rosas was in tension and at odds with others who wanted a unitary state. And so in Argentina, part of the conflict and the bloodshed resulted from the battling of the militias who disagreed about the formation of the incoming state. But elsewhere in Latin America, similar battles were waged for similar reasons. So if you take a look at the number of deaths from war and civil conflict, you'll notice that during the period immediately preceding independence in about 1809, there were almost none at all. In fact, there were zero. But beginning in 1810 and in subsequent decades until 1879, you've got untold levels of death and bloodshed, very, very high proportions given the total population at the time. Deaths per 1,000, death rates of about 18.3 people per 1,000 during the period of 1820 to 1829. I just want to show you this to give you a sense of the pattern and give you a sense of the scale of the violence and the disorder. it's very difficult, as I'm sure you can imagine, to focus on developing or growing the economy, A, when the state does not exist, and B, when civil conflict and civil disorder and violence are so extensive that this degree of death per 1,000 people obtains. To give you a good sense of a contemporary comparison, Syria, during the height of its civil conflict, saw its economy contract by as much as 60% because of very high rates of death from civil conflict and in absolutely decimated investment in the destruction of infrastructure and in communities. So this level of violence in Latin America is what we're working with here and what we're comparing to the violence in Africa. So now that we've considered Africa and Latin America, we can take a look at the rates of growth in Latin America between 1820 and 1870 and Africa between 1950 and 1992. And in Latin America during this period, the rate of growth was barely 0.07%. I'm actually struck that it was even positive at all. I think that what you're mainly picking up here is the fact that there weren't much in the way of institutions set up to propel or sustain economic activity. Much of what did exist, what had been set up by the colonizing powers and was designed to produce and perhaps export natural resources and other commodities during a civil conflict. Those arrangements are strained to the limit. In Africa, it's conceivable that there was even less in the way of economic institutions since in Africa, the colonial period was shorter. But in Africa, very, very low rates of growth as well, 0.89% during this period of 1950 to 1992. These are what the authors from this week refer to as the lost decades. These are periods that cannot be gotten back. These are periods that correspond with very, very slow growth as a result of conflict and disorder and violence and fragmentation. So we've reached this point where we've got this portrait of Africa and Latin America post-independence. And each of these places experienced what we would refer to as lost decades, periods where GDP per capita levels went into decline or fell or contracted, and where the economies did not expand. And what we're going to do for the rest of this week is focus on the different experiences and what they have in common, but what they also don't have in common. And then we'll also pay in particular attention to patrimonialism and clientelism and corruption. And this will be related both to Africa and Latin America. But it's important for us to remember that Latin America and Africa might not be as comparable as we think, in that maybe this comparison is missing some important distinctions or differences that might matter a great deal. So let's step back for a moment and let's discuss whether we think that comparing Latin America and Africa is appropriate, or if we think we need to do a better job specifying some of the differences. In general, what do you think? Do you think the premise of this comparison is acceptable, or do you think that we should say more about what differentiates them? Alondra says, I think the comparison would not be enough without learning more about the level of development before and after of both regions, the influence of colonization, the level of ethnic diversities and political influences. Yeah, absolutely, Alondra. So we know already that in Latin America, for example, there was a big difference sometimes in the level of pre-colonial institutional complexity. Some pre-colonial civilizations were more complex than others, right? And so, maybe colonization is a process that has to be understood in the context of those earlier characteristics of a place. We know, for example, that the Incas and the Maya, the Aztecs were extraordinarily complex societies. And so what, we just don't consider those? What I think we should think about is, how do those pre-colonial features remain relevant, and how do they influence what happens after colonization? Now, that's an interesting question. And it's one that I think needs more attention, because the bias in favor of the role of colonialism tends to ignore those features and characteristics of actual native societies. Anieli says there should be more information about the social cost and policies of the level of development for Africa and in Latin America. Okay. Matt says, I think it is an acceptable baseline comparison, but you could go further into the study of the specific situations of the countries in these continents. So, for example, we know that those economies were reliant on commodity production because the colonial powers had mainly used them for the purpose of extracting wealth, channeling it back to the mother country, as well as using those raw materials domestically. So we know that Latin American and African countries probably have that in common when it comes to their post-independence development. But I would imagine that in Africa, the language diversity and the ethnic diversity might even be more extensive than in many Latin American countries, maybe with the exception of places like Ecuador or Peru, where there's extraordinary complexity in indigenous societies. Anna says the article mentions how the Latin American population was decimated and how that affected the power of the people, while in Africa there is a larger native population. I thought that was very interesting. I never considered that before. Yeah, Anna, that's a really good point. And that's something that we need to remember, because the European settlers in European colonialism in Latin America usually did mean the devastation of those indigenous civilizations, because they weren't protected against the bacteria and the germs and the airborne illnesses that the Europeans had immunity to, and that they brought over with them. And it is interesting to notice that and mention that there was essentially a larger native population, because the effects of slavery were more drawn out over the period of several hundred years, and also more geographically dispersed as well. I think that demographic difference does probably matter, and it's something that we'd have to think a little bit more about. But it means that they don't necessarily start in the same place in terms of where they were. And Walter says on the issue of language, I wonder how much the language barrier affects Africa more than Latin America. Similarly, I think that the fact that more African countries are landlocked than are Latin American countries, that might also complicate the development situation. And it could probably also intensify social divisions too if it results in deprivation and slower economic growth. These are all interesting points. Alondra says, I think we also have to see the regions. I know, for example, some were more successful in transitions to democracies and developing more because of their neighbors. So there was a lot of diffusion in Latin America, and some of that had to do with cultural and historical affinities, shared experiences that were probably more numerous in Latin America than in Africa. Although the experience of decolonization in Africa did have a lot of spillover effect. It's just that the timing of those processes was a little different. Chris says, interesting though, I saw a quote today that said history is always written by the winners and the loser is obliterated. We should learn more of what was already said there. Or what was already there. Agreed, especially with regard to the indigenous and the native civilizations. Walter says it's possible that more language diversity would cause less unity within the continent. Certainly, I think that's a possibility. Listen, everybody, this is a wonderful start. We really did a good job discussing some of the broad similarities and differences today. We'll investigate these further by taking a look at how African and Latin American countries wrestled with clientelism and corruption in pursuit of development in the post-independence period. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here, and I'll see you on Wednesday.